Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're continuing my updated ultimate guide to spells with the level 5 spells, the second most powerful spell slot in the game. 5th level spells have some of the strongest direct damage spells, the weirdest and most interesting utility spells, and also 2 of the 3 secret spells, so there's a lot of just very cool stuff going on at this spell level. It also contains several of the very worst spells in the game, just pure traps that either do completely nothing or actively harm your party when cast. So knowing which ones to use and which ones to avoid at this level is very important. At this point, you know the drill. I've already gone over the rating system and definitions of the tiers, so we're just going to get right into it. But before I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Chavi Garg for the 100 rupee donation, Tarantula for the $5, and Sean McGaffey, FMT, and David Ramos for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. It really means a lot. Alright, let's talk 5th level spells. We're going to start with Banishing Smite. Banishing Smite is a paladin smite attack, so it works the same as other smites, although unlike most of them, can be made either with ranged or with a melee attack. Although it is a paladin spell, technically, paladins in Baldur's Gate can't actually get it because it's a 5th level spell slot, which they never reach in only 12 levels in this game. So Banishing Smite is actually only available through being a bard and selecting it at level 10 with one of your magical secrets picks, or as of patch 8, being a Hexblade Warlock who also gets access to this spell. It's a smite spell, so made as part of a weapon attack, and it requires, in addition to that, your bonus action and your concentration, and it does your normal weapon damage, plus 5d10 additional force damage, for an average of 27.5 extra damage, which is a pretty significant amount, especially because as an attack roll, this can critically hit. It works really well with guaranteed critical hit effects in order to double that damage output. In addition to the extra damage that you get, if an enemy is reduced below 50 hit points, so if they have between 1 and 49 hit points after you hit them with Banishing Smite, they're banished for 2 turns. No saving throw on this, simply removed from the game for 2 turns. If you plan your attacks well, you can mostly think of this as doing just an extra 50 damage, because if you reduce an enemy below 50 health and they get banished, any enemy who's returning from banishment with less than 50 HP is certainly going to die before they take another turn. So a lot of the time when you cast Banishing Smite, it's going to do about 75 extra damage or 100 extra damage on a critical hit, because if you reduce the enemy below the threshold, then they'll get banished. And that's a pretty good use of a level 5 spell slot. 100 damage to one enemy, if you can guarantee a critical, is very, very powerful. So even though this is a very expensive spell to cast, when you line everything up so that it works well, it does do the thing that you want it to do pretty effectively. The downside of this spell is that it is kind of hard to get for a lot of characters, and it competes with other really valuable things. For a bard, picking it with magical secrets, that's an incredibly important class feature that you want to spend on the very best spells in the game, so you have to give up something pretty powerful to get Banishing Smite. Lore and Glamour bards obviously never want this because they're rarely attacking with weapons. Valor and Swords bards can take it, but may have better choices with their magical secrets. Things like Counterspell, Command, or Hunger of Hadar may be more powerful for those characters. So while some builds for Swords bards in particular will take Banishing Smite, a lot of the time you still won't want this spell just because magical secrets is such an important thing to spend on really powerful stuff. For Warlocks, it's a lot easier. Hexblade Warlocks just have to spend a level 5 spell known slot on this, and level 5 spells for Warlocks are not heavily contested, so you will often take Banishing Smite. You probably won't cast it that often because it requires your concentration, which is an extremely important resource for a Warlock. Concentration is heavily contested for Warlocks, but there are times where the extra 100 damage is exactly what you want, so for a Hexblade Warlock, you're definitely going to use this sometimes. I'm going to give it B tier. There are some specific builds that can make use of it, and like Paladin, Sword Bard multiclasses can stack this on top of other smite spells for really ridiculous melee burst damage. And Hexblade Warlocks will always have some use for this, even if they won't use it in every combat, so Banishing Smite, pretty solid spell with very high upside. Next up, Cloudkill. Cloudkill is a ground-targeted damage spell. It's 60-foot range and 20-foot radius, which is a pretty large radius, and everything inside of it takes 5d8 poison damage, with a constitution save for half, and then takes that damage again at the beginning of each of their turns. Like a lot of other ground-targeted damage spells, that lets you double dip when you do damage to enemies, because they take the initial cast damage, and then they also take the damage again at the beginning of their turn, so they're going to take damage twice before they get to act. Cloudkill also, as long as you concentrate on it for 10 turns, lets you recast the spell to move the cloud, with only 30-foot range, and that 30-foot range is from the caster, not from the initial location of the cloud, so you can end up moving this across the battlefield as long as you're moving your character in between movements. Since recasting Cloudkill counts as casting the spell again, enemies who you put the new Cloudkill on top of will take the initial Cloudkill damage, and then again at the beginning of their turn will take damage. So effectively, Cloudkill does 10d8 damage every turn, as long as you're spending your action to recast it, or 5d8 damage every turn if you're not recasting it, because you can double dip on it by spending an action. This is actually pretty solid turn-over-turn damage. Enemies will take an average of 45 damage before they get to act, and you can recast it each turn to do that 45 damage additionally, or just let enemies who are stuck in it take the 22.5 damage that it does without any input from the character if you want to spend your turns doing something else, as long as they don't break your concentration. So you can use Cloudkill pretty effectively to wipe out weaker enemies. The downside of this spell is that it is a constitution saving throw, which enemies will typically have good constitution saves, so they'll often end up taking only half of the damage from the Cloudkill, and it's poison damage. Something like half of the relevant enemies in the game are immune to poison damage, so there's a lot of encounters where Cloudkill is going to be useless, or they'll be resistant to it and have really good con saves, so it'll be basically useless. So only in some encounters will Cloudkill be effective. In those encounters, though, if you need a damage spell, it's a pretty good one. You can layer it on top of surface effects to keep enemies inside it without having to reposition it, or reposition it to double up on the damage and also get extra damage output. And all of those are pretty valuable uses of the spell. There's also some neat tricks that you can do with Cloudkill. Hero's Feast makes you immune to the effects of Cloudkill, because it makes you immune to the poisoned condition, and the way that Cloudkill is coded, it actually does its damage through inflicting the poisoned condition, which then does the poison damage. So if your party has Hero's Feast on, they're immune to Cloudkill and can actually stand happily inside the Cloudkill, and force melee enemies to fight them inside it, taking constant damage over every single turn, which is pretty powerful. The Cloudkill that you get from Markaheshkir is also kind of interesting, because if you have the poison version of Markaheshkir active, enemies actually get poisoned and take disadvantage on their attack rolls as well. So that can be a pretty powerful tool. Usually, obviously, you're not going to use the poison version of Markaheshkir, but if you're doing a themed build, that's a kind of fun thing that you can do with the spell. The downsides of Cloudkill are pretty high. Because in a lot of encounters, it just won't be good. Enemies will be resistant, or doing damage every turn just isn't the goal in that encounter, because you need to bring down one high health enemy instead of a bunch of low health enemies, and Cloudkill suffers in those spots as well. But for the encounters where this is good, for a pure damage spell, the spell is quite good. It just does a lot of damage when you can get full value out of it. I'm going to give it C tier, even so, because the things that hold it back do hold it back pretty significantly. So you're only going to use this in a couple encounters, but honestly, this is a pretty high C tier, because the encounters where it's good, it's actually very good. Cone of Cold. Cone of Cold is an AoE burst damage spell. It's a 30-foot cone, which means that you'll usually be able to get 2 or 3 enemies in it, but can sometimes have trouble hitting the entire encounter unless you use an effect to group enemies together before casting this spell. It does 8d8 cold damage for an average of 36, with a constitution save for half, and of course, because this is cold damage, you can double that 36 average damage to 72 average damage if you get enemies wet. This is a pretty decent AoE damage spell, which is certainly not bad in a wet and cold party, but because it's a constitution save, that does decrease the value of the spell somewhat. A lot of enemies have good constitution saves, so Cone of Cold will often have enemies succeed against the saving throw. But the amount of damage that you get from this for a 5th level spell slot, if you've used Minor Illusion or Black Hole to group enemies together, can be pretty immense. So in some encounters where there's lots of medium health enemies, Cone of Cold can be very good. Where this spell really shines, though, is in multiples. If you have a sorcerer or wizard and a warlock in your party, and they both have access to Cone of Cold, because this is a sorcerer wizard spell, it's also available to fiend or hexblade warlocks, layering 2 Cones of Cold on top of each other can be really powerful. You'll cast something like Create Water to get a big group of enemies wet, and then double Cone of Cold them for a huge amount of burst damage. That's an average of 144 damage in an AoE. And because you put a water surface on the ground and then hit it with cold damage, it will also create an ice surface. So Cone of Cold can also, in that case, be used as a crowd control effect to knock any enemies who survive it prone. This is a pretty powerful tool in the late game. A lot of encounters can be solved if you have multiple Cone of Cold casters by using Minor Illusion or Black Hole to group enemies, dropping Create Water on top of them, and then just double coning them until they all explode. And so usually you're not going to want to cast this spell if you are only going to cast it once, but if you plan to use 2 5th level spell slots in an encounter, double Cone of Cold can often be the best way to just end that encounter immediately. Even in the late game, 140 damage to everything in the encounter will blow up a lot of encounters in their entirety, or leave only one really tough enemy. So this is a very powerful strategy, and since it's available to both warlocks and sorcerers and wizards, you are reasonably likely to have multiple characters that can cast this spell, and druids as well, given the right land druids as well, given the right circle selection. You're reasonably likely to have multiple characters that can cast this spell, or you can use a scroll for one of them and use a normal spell cast for the other in order to get full value out of it. Overall, I'm going to give this spell B tier. You don't usually want to just cast Cone of Cold normally, but if you build your party around setting up to make maximum use of it, then it can be very powerful. And also for Hexblade Warlocks in particular, this is just a really nice option to have because it's their best source of AoE burst damage. So some parties are going to get good use of it, and others will ignore it. B tier for Cone of Cold. Conjure Elemental. I could and probably should at some point do an entire video on just this spell, because the amount of options that Conjure Elemental gives you is incredible. The short version is that this is the best high-level summon spell in the game, and summoning is an incredible strategy in Baldur's Gate 3, so Conjure Elemental is an enormous benefit for any party, giving you effectively an extra whole party member, because the elementals and myrmidons that you summon with this spell are basically as strong as a normal character, so you more or less just give yourself an extra party member all day at the cost of your 5th or 6th level spell slot. There are 8 possible ways that you can use Conjure Elemental. With a 5th level spell, you can summon an air, earth, fire, or water elemental, and if you upcast it to 6th level, you can summon an air, earth, fire, or water myrmidon. All 8 of these modes are good. Actually, strong shout out to the Baldur's Gate 3 balance team, because all 8 of the possible ways that you can cast Conjure Elemental are viable, powerful, and even optimal given certain encounters and party compositions. So I highly encourage you to experiment with Conjure Elemental and summoning different elementals and different myrmidons to see which one works best given your specific party composition and what encounters you are facing and what your party actually needs, because they're all pretty viable. If you don't want to spend a lot of time experimenting with this spell, a good default in Baldur's Gate is to just always choose the water versions of everything, because you can double their damage with Create Water, it'll synergize with other cold and lightning effects that you have in your party, and so they're just always a good option. But I highly encourage you to play around with this spell and summon all 8 of the modes in order to find the one that works particularly well with your character. For the 5th level spell slot, you get a very solid summon that's very powerful all day, and this is usually going to be the best use of the 5th level spell slot for a character who has access to this spell until you hit 6th level, and then you're probably going to want to upcast Conjure Elemental. This is overall the most valuable use of a 6th level spell slot in the game, and so most characters that have access to this are going to want to spend their 1 6th level spell per day on Conjure Elemental. It outcompetes most of the actual 6th level spells in the game. This is just an incredibly powerful summoning effect. The summon is very tough, does a lot of damage, has a lot of utility no matter which one you pick. And like I said, it's basically like adding an extra character to your party for the entire day. S tier, of course, for Conjure Elemental. Contagion. Contagion is a pretty weird spell with a lot of different possible effects that works in a pretty unusual way in Baldur's Gate 3. How it works is you make a melee spell attack against an enemy, so against their armor class. And if you hit, then they're inflicted with poison, no saving throw, which gives them disadvantage on all their attack rolls and skill checks. Each turn, while they're under this poison effect, they have to make a Constitution saving throw. If they get 3 failures before they get 3 successes, then they're inflicted with a permanent disease chosen at the time when you cast the spell, and there's 6 possibilities for which disease they're going to get. If they get 3 successes before they get 3 failures, then the spell goes away and doesn't do anything. What that means is if you hit with the initial melee attack, enemies are going to be poisoned for a minimum of 2 turns, even if they pass 3 saving throws in a row, they'll be poisoned for at least 2 turns. So it's a reasonable no-save debuff, though disadvantage on attack rolls is just not what you want to spend your 5th level spell slot on. And if they fail all the saves, then you can inflict a pretty nasty disease on them, which is, depending on which one you chose, quite debilitating. In combat, this spell is basically useless. It's a melee spell attack. Enemies have to fail 3 Constitution saving throws before they succeed on 3 of them, so it's going to take a minimum of 3 turns before the effect that you actually want from Contagion applies. And combat simply won't go that long, so it's very unreliable. The effect is kind of minor up until that point, so you should never cast this spell in combat. However, Contagion has a unique property, which is, or I guess not unique, but unusual property, similar to Bestow Curse. If you hit with the initial melee attack to apply Contagion, it doesn't count as a hostile action, so you can cast this spell outside of combat before combat begins in order to inflict one of the diseases. Weirdly, if you miss with the attack roll, it does count as taking a hostile action, so you have to be pretty certain that you're going to hit if you want to use Contagion. You're never going to use this spell in combat, it's just too slow and unreliable, but outside of combat, putting these debuffs on an enemy before combat begins can end an encounter before it starts, very similar to Bestow Curse. The diseases that enemies can get can be extremely dangerous. There's 6 possibilities, but almost always you're going to want to use either Flesh Rot, which, if it applies to them, will give them vulnerability to all damage, which obviously is immensely powerful, or Slimy Doom, which, if it applies, will stun them every single time they take damage, so an enemy affected by Slimy Doom is effectively just killed instantly because they'll never get a turn again as long as you can do a single point of damage to them in an entire turn cycle. Pretty easy to manage. The others do sometimes have their place. Mindfire can confuse an enemy, can confuse a neutral character, which then turns them hostile, and then it doesn't count as a crime to kill them, so there is a use for that, but mostly it's going to be Flesh Rot or Slimy Doom. The real comparison that you have to make with Contagion, which is an out-of-combat debuff, is to Bestow Curse. And Bestow Curse is a pretty powerful tool, and usually going to be better. It's a much lower-level spell slot that also can just win encounters, so you're spending a level 2 instead of a level 5 spell slot, and that's significantly less expensive. And Contagion also has the problem that it is both poison and a disease, and a lot of enemies are going to be immune to those effects, so there's plenty of enemies that you can't land this on. But the effects when you do land Contagion on an enemy are incredibly powerful, and you can take a few tries at it as long as you don't miss your melee attacks. So if you know you want to fight an enemy who's neutral to you before combat starts, then you can get this. You can at least take a crack at applying Contagion for free, and if it works, you almost certainly just win that combat instantly. I'm going to give it C tier because it's mostly just outcompeted by Bestow Curse, which is just much cheaper, and there's a lot of enemies that it doesn't work against. But when you do land this spell, you do just instantly kill whatever you landed it on. Destructive Wave. Destructive Wave is an AoE damage spell, and it kind of breaks my rating system a little bit because we've been talking about whether you should learn or prepare these spells, but Destructive Wave is available only as a domain spell to Tempest and Light Clerics, so they never have to make the choice of whether they're going to prepare this spell or not, since any character that has access to this spell will always have it available. So we'll talk about whether you should spend your actions and spell slots on casting it, and the answer is basically yes. Destructive Wave is a pretty good AoE damage spell. It does 10d6 Thunder and 10d6 of either Radiant 5d6 Thunder and 5d6 of either Radiant or Necrotic damage for a total of 10d6, which is 35 average damage in a 30-foot AoE centered on the caster. Enemies get a Constitution save, and if they fail the save, then they're also knocked prone. If they succeed on the save, then they're not knocked prone and take half damage from the spell. A big AoE damage spell that also knocks enemies prone is pretty good. Knocking enemies prone is very powerful in Baldur's Gate 3, and there's a lot of stuff you can do with it. It's also some relevant damage types. Both Thunder and Radiant damage are extremely relevant damage types for itemization, especially, of course, for Tempest and Light Clerics. Though it's worth noting that there's a couple bugs with the Thunder damage portion of this spell, where not everything that works with Thunder damage works with Destructive Wave, because it's not properly tagged as Thunder damage. A lot of effects will, but some effects won't, including the ability to maximize Thunder damage as a Tempest Cleric, so you can't maximize the Thunder damage half of this spell. The other important thing to know about this spell is that the description is incorrect. It says that it damages all creatures within 30 feet of you, but that's wrong. It's only enemies, so you can use this safely no matter where your cleric is positioned. And this just makes a great non-concentration damage and control spell for a Tempest or Light Cleric. Those characters will often want to be up in the mix anyways, so you'll hit the entire encounter. An enemy who's knocked prone and in the difficult terrain from your Spirit Guardians may not be able to get out of Spirit Guardians, because they'll have a vastly reduced movement speed. So Destructive Wave is just a very powerful damage and control option, doesn't take your concentration. Characters that have it always have it available, so they'll be using it pretty often. A tier. Next up, Dispel Good and Evil. So this is a funny spell to rate because I was making the icons for this spell tier list and I saw this one and realized I had literally completely forgotten that this spell existed at all. Dispel Good and Evil is a 5th level version of a 1st level spell, Protection from Evil and Good, and basically it's exactly the same spell, except it costs a 5th level spell slot instead of a 1st level spell slot, only lasts for 10 turns, and can only be cast on yourself. In addition to that, the disadvantage on attack rolls that aberrations are supposed to get doesn't work because it's bugged for this version of the spell. So it's literally just a worse version of a 1st level spell that you can cast with a 5th level spell. For the 10 turns that you have it active, it also gives you the ability to spend your action to break an ally out of Charm, Frighten, or Possess, except that action mostly doesn't work on most Charm, Frighten, or Possess effects. So you're effectively spending a 5th level spell slot to get a buggier and significantly worse version of a 1st level spell that's already kind of a marginal 1st level spell. Obviously, you shouldn't cast this spell. It's kind of laughable how bad this spell is, honestly. I'm glad it exists because it's funny how terrible it is. Dominate Person. Dominate Person is a single target control spell, and I mean control, of course, in the truest sense of the word, because it forces an enemy to fight for you. It only can target humanoids, so same targeting restrictions as Hold Person, and the enemy that you target has to make a Wisdom saving throw, or for 10 turns, they swap sides and fight on your side. You don't get complete control over the character, they just treat you as an ally and your enemies as enemies, so they'll follow you around and fight for you, but you don't get to actually control their actions, so they may not do what you want in a given combat. In addition to that, whenever they take damage, they get a new Wisdom saving throw to shrug off the effect. So in longer fights where you would want to use this effect, it's probably not going to last very long because the enemy that you target with it is going to get a lot of chances to break out of it. Still, it's a pretty powerful tool to reduce the enemy's numbers by 1 and increase your numbers by 1, so it's not the worst case scenario if you land this spell. It's just unreliable, it doesn't have a lot of targets, and it only targets one enemy. So if you're fighting, say, 5 humanoid creatures, or you could use Hold Person to get 4 of them out of the fight, or you could use Dominate Monster with a 5th level spell slot, or you could use Dominate Monster to dominate person, excuse me, to get one of them fighting on your side. And usually you would rather just use an AoE control spell or a spell like Hold Person instead of Dominate Person. The problem with this spell is just the opportunity cost. It costs a 5th level spell slot, and you could use that to shut down the entire encounter rather than just swap one enemy onto your side, and they may not do anything and they may break out of it immediately. So in combat, this spell is just not significantly powerful. There are a couple uses for this spell for sort of story events. You can use this to allow you to protect a character that you want to keep alive. So dominating Minsk, for example, can let you then put buffs on him to keep him alive during the combat where you need to do that. So there are some cases where you can use this for story events, but like most of the time, Dominate Person is just not an efficient use of your turn or spell slot. I'm going to give it D tier because even the very marginal uses of this spell, I don't think it's worth preparing and casting. If you do ever need the effect, there's some items and scrolls that can provide it, so you should rarely actually cast the spell itself. And the chance that you do need the effect is very low. D tier. Flamestrike. Flamestrike is an AoE damage spell available to clerics and fiend warlocks, and it does 5d6 radiant damage and 5d6 fire damage in a 10-foot radius, 60-foot range, with a dexterity saving throw for half. 10d6 damage is fairly easy to compare because that's the same amount of damage that an upcasted fireball would do if you used a 5th level spell slot for it in a smaller radius. So you're kind of getting a worse version of fireball for a higher level spell slot in a lot of cases. The fact that it's radiant damage is relevant, of course, for clerics especially, who get access to this spell. And clerics don't get AoE burst damage the way that wizards or sorcerers do, so comparing it to fireball directly is not always the exact comparison that you want, because a lot of clerics just don't have an equivalent spell effect. If you are not a Tempest, Light, or Death Domain cleric, Flamestrike is your best source of AoE burst damage. That's not something that clerics really want, though. You can probably just do your damage based on casting Spirit Guardians and running next to enemies, rather than spending your time on Flamestrike. So unless you have a very specific encounter where you need AoE burst damage, this is just a worse version of a lower level spell, and you usually shouldn't cast it. I'm going to give it C tier because there are some encounters where you do want your cleric to do AoE burst damage, even in a very inefficient way, and Flamestrike is your best tool for doing that. But the times when you use the spell should be few and far between because you're just spending a high-level spell slot on a fairly marginal effect. Greater Restoration. This lets you touch an ally, so it's melee range, and you can remove any charm, petrification, stun, or curse currently affecting them. Being able to remove dangerous effects is pretty useful. I talked about this with Freedom of Movement. But Freedom of Movement breaks you out of stuns and also gives you a relevant buff for the rest of the day, and also only costs a 4th level spell slot compared to Greater Restoration's 5th level spell slot. Being able to remove charms and curses in addition to stuns is sometimes relevant, though a lot of time you can just become immune to charm, and curse you can remove with Remove Curse, a lower level spell as well. So Greater Restoration is mostly going to be used to break you out of stuns, just like Freedom of Movement, and Freedom of Movement does a better job with more upsides. Being able to break out of petrification is almost completely irrelevant in Baldur's Gate. It's very hard to get yourself petrified, so it just won't happen. So Greater Restoration just doesn't really have a use case. It's completely duplicated by lower level spells, D tier. Next up, Hold Monster. Hold Monster is, of course, the same as Hold Person, except that it works on any creature except for undead, instead of only on humanoids. It costs a 5th level spell slot instead of a 2nd level spell slot for the same effect, but being able to target a lot more creatures means that sometimes this is exactly the spell that you want. Paralysis is an incredibly devastating condition. It's the most dangerous thing to be afflicted with in Baldur's Gate 3. Automatic critical hits and inability to act are very powerful. And although the enemy gets a saving throw to break out every turn, you'll always get at least one round of automatic critical hits against them, and it can cost them multiple turns as well. The difference between spending a 2nd level spell slot and a 5th level spell slot on this spell is immense. And also, Hold Monster can't easily be used to disable whole encounters the way Hold Person can. Just like Hold Person, you can upcast it for an extra target per spell level, but you can only upcast it up to level 6 unless you're playing with mods that let you increase your maximum level or whatever. So the maximum number of creatures you can hit with Hold Monster is 2, which is a lot less effective than locking down 5 enemies with a 6th level Hold Person. So in the encounters where you want to lock down an enemy, which are most of them, Hold Monster is going to be a good option if Hold Person doesn't work. It's especially powerful for sword bards and characters and hexblades, characters using Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, who can use Hold Monster as a bonus action while building up arcane acuity stacks, and then also benefit from the automatic critical hits. So Hold Monster is very, very powerful when you do land it, but it is very, very expensive as well, costing a 5th level spell slot. I'm going to give this A tier because you won't want to use it. Any fight where you can use Hold Person, you would prefer to use that because it's much cheaper. But when you don't have an alternative, Hold Monster is still an amazing effect, and you're definitely going to want to land it in a lot of encounters, so A tier. Next up, Insect Plague. Insect Plague is a ground-targeted AoE damage over time spell. Lasts for up to 10 turns, or as long as you concentrate on it, and it does 4d10 piercing damage every turn with a Constitution save for half. That's 22 average damage, which is not that much for a 5th level spell slot. And unlike other ground-targeted damage spells, Insect Plague does its damage at the end of the enemy's turn, so you can't double dip on the damage. You get the initial cast damage, but then they'll almost always just move out before taking damage again, unless you can keep them inside the effects of the Insect Plague. It's a little easier to do that because the area also counts as difficult terrain, so enemies will move at half speed, but they can often just jump out. They also have disadvantage on perception checks while they're in the radius, which is almost entirely irrelevant. That only matters if you're making stealth checks, but not stealth checks from greater invisibility. So enemies having disadvantage on perception checks is rarely, if ever, going to come up. The upshot of the spell is that it's just a level 5 spell slot that does damage and doesn't do very much damage. A 22 average damage with a Constitution saving throw for half is pretty sad at this level. It's only 2 more damage than a Cloud of Daggers cast at level 2. So it's going to be significantly harder so it's just not very efficient, and enemies can save against the damage of this spell, which they can't against Cloud of Daggers. So Insect Plague is mostly just dominated by other damage options. Even at level 5, you have Cloudkill, which you can double dip on the damage and recast, so it does way more damage in the same radius. So Insect Plague is just very inefficient in terms of spell slot to damage ratio, and I wouldn't recommend casting the spell. There's a couple minor tricks you can do with it. It is piercing damage, so you could give enemies vulnerability with the Ballast Armor or the Bloodthirst Dagger, but giving them vulnerability to small amounts of piercing damage isn't what you really want to do with those broken items. You want to give them vulnerability to huge amounts of damage. So Insect Plague is just not really worth casting. D tier. It's just a damage spell that doesn't do enough damage. Mass Cure Wounds. This is an AoE healing spell. It basically lets you cast Cure Wounds, but on up to 6 creatures instead of on just 1 creature. And it has 60-foot range, so you can use Mass Cure Wounds usually to heal every creature in your party in an encounter. For 3d8 plus your spellcasting modifier. So you get a little bit more healing than you do with level 1 Cure Wounds. It's sort of like casting level 3 Cure Wounds on everyone in your party. This is a healing spell, and it does do a decent amount of healing if your whole party is injured, but spending your action on a reactive healing spell in Baldur's Gate 3 is typically not an efficient use of your turns. Enemy damage will outpace healing, and usually be done without spending something really valuable like a level 5 spell slot in order to negate it. If an enemy is just attacking you with weapons, then you're probably not even keeping up on the damage when you're casting this spell, and it's not costing them anything and is costing you stuff. So Mass Cure Wounds just suffers from the problem that healing suffers from in general in Dungeons & Dragons. The numbers are too low, doesn't keep up with incoming damage. It's an inherently defensive strategy that costs you resources, so it's not progressing your game plan. So without other sources of bonuses from healing, you usually don't want to spend your turn on it. The Mass Cure Wounds in particular struggles because Mass Healing Word exists, and if the best way to use healing in Baldur's Gate is to apply the buff on healing items, which Mass Healing Word does with only a bonus action and a 3rd level spell slot instead of a 5th level spell slot. So maybe you could use this if an enemy has hit you with an AoE spell. You can undo the damage from the AoE spell, but even then you're just trading your turn for their turn reactively, which is not a great thing to be doing strategically, and your resources are more important than enemies. So Mass Cure Wounds is just conceptually not a strong spell, and the numbers don't back it up. D tier, you usually shouldn't cast it. Next up, Planar Binding. Planar Binding is the same as Dominate Person, except instead of working on humanoids, it works on celestials, elementals, fae, or fiends. It doesn't have the Dominate Person problem of Hold Person targeting the same creatures and just being cheaper and better, but Hold Monster is typically just is going to target the same creatures and is typically going to be a better use of your spell slot, because Planar Binding has all of the problems that Dominate Person has, where enemies get lots of saving throws against it because they can save against it every time they take damage. Having an NPC ally fighting on your side can often be more dangerous for you because the AI can often do things that are actively counterproductive to your combats, and you don't get control of the character's actual actions, and it's still fairly unreliable. It also suffers from the additional problem of a lot of the enemies who are celestials, elementals, fae, or fiends are just immune to this effect. So against the creatures that you can target with this spell, a lot of the time it simply won't work because they'll be immune to domination and charm effects, and so Planar Binding won't succeed against them. This spell does have some uses. There's a couple merchants who fall into these categories, and you can use Planar Binding to do kind of funny things where you steal all their money and whatever. But otherwise, it is just not useful to spend your turns casting this in combat. If you want this to lock down this type of enemy, Hold Monster just does a better and more reliable job, so you really shouldn't cast Planar Binding either. D tier. Next up, Seeming. Seeming is another in the proud tradition of 5th level spells that are duplicating lower level spells, but more expensive and much worse. Seeming is a 5th level spell that lets you cast Disguise Self on up to 4 creatures. Disguise Self, of course, is a level 1 ritual spell, so you can have it from the beginning of the game and it costs nothing to cast, whereas Seeming costs you a 5th level spell slot and lets you target your whole party. That's completely useless because in Baldur's Gate, you don't need more than one party member disguised. Disguising is almost exclusively used for conversations, and you can't have more than one character in a given conversation. So if you have another party member just standing in the background, the NPCs don't care at all what they look like. So disguising more characters just doesn't matter at all compared to using Disguise Self, even if you weren't able to just get that for free on every party member anyways because it's a ritual spell. Seeming is therefore an incredible waste of resources. I do think that there's something interesting about this spell, which is that the problem with it is a fundamental design flaw in Baldur's Gate 3. One of the things that annoys me most about Baldur's Gate is that you can't have more than one character in a conversation, even when they're standing right there. You know, if my barbarian main character is asked by an NPC to identify a magical artifact, I cannot just ask Gale about it. I have to make my Arcana check myself, which is just ridiculous. Seeming would maybe have usage if the game was set up so that multiple characters could participate in conversations. But since that's not true, it's completely useless. I'm torn as to whether Dispel Good and Evil or Seeming is the worst spell in Baldur's Gate 3, but it's probably one of the two. D tier. Next up, Telekinesis. Telekinesis is a unique spell with a really fun effect. It basically lets you pick up and throw an object or enemy once every turn for 10 turns. When you cast Telekinesis, if you cast it on an object, you can just throw it as though you were using the throw command. And if you cast it on a creature, they get a strength saving throw, which if they fail, you can throw a character in any direction. You can concentrate on it for up to 10 turns, and each turn you can spend your action to recast Telekinesis and throw another thing. The upside of Telekinesis is there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do when you can reposition enemies, and it has 60-foot range, so unlike the normal throw command, you can use this to grab enemies and pull them towards you if you want to, because you can throw them in any direction. So you can use this to push enemies back into damaging crowd control effects or dangerous battlefield control spells that they have escaped from. You can use it to throw them off of chasms into instant death. You can use it to throw enemies into each other, dealing damage and knocking each of them prone. You can use it to grab enemies who are up on high ground or something like that and pull them down onto low ground while also potentially dealing damage and knocking them prone. So there's a lot of neat things that you can do with this spell and a lot of creative uses that you can put it to in order to have impact in combat. The downside of this spell is that it's just a throw, which is something that a character with high strength can just do. So spending a 5th level spell slot on this effect that you can duplicate basically for free is not always going to be the most interesting use of your spell slot. You can also often duplicate the effect of this with a shove, which is a bonus action, and not take any action resources in order to get a very similar effect to Telekinesis. There's a couple things that work in Telekinesis's favor, though, which is that there's no weight limit. So while even with high strength, you can't pick up and throw larger or heavier enemies. With Telekinesis, you can do that, so you can grab enemies who normally you wouldn't be able to throw and chuck them into dangerous effects or off of cliffs or whatever, giving you a lot more options to use it. And of course, repositioning enemies is always powerful. There's also one severe game-breaking bug that you should be aware of when using Telekinesis. Or I guess spell-breaking bug, which is that when you cast it on an enemy, if it's the first time you cast it and they make their initial strength saving throw, if they succeed on the throw, the game does not. The game just cancels the spell. You don't get to concentrate on it, and you don't get to recast it next turn. So you usually want to start by casting Telekinesis on an object in order to get the concentration effect. Otherwise, there's a chance that you can just lose the spell completely if an enemy makes their save on just the first one because of this very severe bug. It's very unfortunate that they still haven't fixed that at this point. So just be aware that when you cast Telekinesis, you're usually going to want to start casting it before combat, grab an object so that you can get the recast and then use it on an enemy over and over. The number of uses that you can put this spell to, I think, make it pretty solid in some encounters, especially if there are chasms, then you can use Telekinesis to throw enemies into those, and the ability to snatch enemies off of high ground and drop them down to where your characters can hit them is pretty powerful, so I'm going to give it B tier. Even though it duplicates something that you can often do otherwise, there's enough times where Telekinesis gives you some cool and unique tactical possibilities, and creative players can make great use of this spell that I think it is very much worth paying attention to when you're playing the game. Next up, Wall of Stone. Wall of Stone is a wall spell similar to Wall of Fire in that you draw a line between 2 points and the effect of the spell happens along that line. And it lasts as long as you concentrate on it and basically just creates a wall. When you draw the line of Wall of Stone, pillars, each of which is about 10 feet long, appear and they're connected to each other, so you make a solid wall of stone along that line that enemies can't shoot or walk through, or nobody can shoot or walk through. Each individual segment of the wall has 30 HP, immunity to psychic damage because it's made of rock, and vulnerability to force and thunder damage. Unlike other objects, though, it doesn't have hardness or resilience, so 30 HP by the time you get Wall of Stone is going to die in 1 or 2 hits from enemies, so enemies who want to break this wall to get to you often can, and the AI is programmed to attack it, so they will try to break the Wall of Stone in order to get to you. You can use this to block certain attacks, like if an enemy is about to use an AoE attack that you know is coming, you can use Wall of Stone to block it, and you can use it to divide an encounter in half, where half of the enemies have to break through the wall and half of them you can fight, but it costs your concentration and 5th level spell slot, so it's incredibly expensive to cast this spell, and doesn't do by itself anything to control enemies or do damage, so you really need to catch them on the other side of the wall, and even then, they can often break through it. Wall of Stone is also made worse by the fact that it is very inconsistent. Like other wall spells in Baldur's Gate 3, the casting interface is incredibly sensitive and fiddly. Even a tiny amount of intervening terrain can cause you to be just unable to cast the spell along a line. So actually blocking an entire arena with this to seal enemies on the other side of it can be extremely difficult. If there's even a single step or a single object on the ground, you can just not be able to cast the wall. And what's worse with Wall of Stone is sometimes it won't not let you cast it, but also won't let the pillar spawn. So intervening terrain can cause the wall to just spawn with a hole in it, which completely removes the purpose of this spell if enemies can just walk through it or shoot through it. So although this is a spell that I personally love and am always trying to find cool uses for it and cast it way more often than you should, the inconsistency and overall the fact that it is a spell that's more tricky than it is good just make it not really very usable in actual practice. Even if you find the perfect use for it, it might not work, and sometimes it might not work in a way that still costs you the spell slot. And the times when you are going to find a perfect use for it are somewhat few and far between. So, unfortunately, because I love this spell and wish it were better, I'm going to have to give it D tier. It's just too hard to make it do anything useful. So, there are 2 more spells remaining in 5th level, and depending on the point that you have reached in the game, you may or may not recognize the remaining 2 spells. That's because the next 2 spells and 1 other level 6 spell are the game's 3 secret spells, which are only available through a specific story event. You will get scrolls of each of these spells, which you can either use normally, casting them from the scroll, or a wizard can scribe them into their spellbook. That's obviously the power fantasy of any wizard, is to find a unique spell that nobody else gets to know and learn it and be able to cast it. So it's really cool that these are in the game. And when you get to the story event that lets you have them, you're going to get some pretty powerful tools as a result of getting these secret spells. So if you don't recognize these spells, that's what they're from. You're going to find scrolls of them, and a wizard character can scribe and learn these spells and then be able to cast them normally. The first of these secret spells is Curriculum of Strategy, Artistry of War. Yes, that is the full name of the spell. I've just put Artistry of War here because it wouldn't fit on the tier list icon. It is, in fact, a very long spell name. Curriculum of Strategy, Artistry of War is basically a souped-up magic missile. The spell description talks about summoning 6 master strategists, but that's all flavor text. What it does is fire 6 powered-up magic missiles, which, just like Magic Missile, you can fire at one specific enemy or split them across multiple enemies, and just like Magic Missile, cannot miss and always do their damage. Each of these 6 bolts will do 2d6 plus 6 force damage for an average of 13 damage, or 72 average damage across all 6 of them. So this is a lot of force damage that you get from this single spell. Because it can't miss and there's no saving throw against it, it's also incredibly reliable, although it doesn't benefit from all of the bonuses that you can apply to magic missiles. But a lot of them, it does. It's done in 6 damage instances, so it will trigger Hex 6 times, or Hexblade's Curse 6 times. It will trigger Polar Louvre 6 times, and other damage riders it will add 6 times over. So you can end up with an enormous amount of additional damage. And for a magic missile build in particular, this is going to be a really powerful upgrade that you can cast once per short rest. This spell does in fact have a mandatory short rest cooldown. In addition to the level 5 spell slot that it costs, you can only cast it once per short rest. So you can't use it multiple times in the same fight, and if you don't short rest in between fights, you may have to go some fights without it. But for a spell this powerful, you won't need to cast it more than once per fight, and you can just blow up one enemy or finish off a bunch of low or even moderately low health enemies with it extremely easily. If you're built around it, it's absurdly powerful, but even if you're not, this is still an incredible amount of damage and highly reliable and also extremely modular, which makes it really good at finishing off low health enemies or just doing guaranteed damage to enemies in an extremely useful way. Can't miss, there's no saving throw, and the minimum damage on this spell is very high. Each bolt does 2d6 plus 6, which is a minimum of 8 damage. So this spell does a minimum of 48 total damage, even if you were to roll a 1 on every one of the 12 d6s that you're rolling. It's very unlikely, obviously. You would still do a minimum of 48 damage, so this spell is incredibly reliable. Just as with Magic Missile, randomness is the enemy of optimization, and this spell is almost entirely non-random, so in addition to being incredibly powerful, really high damage, it also bypasses one of the ways that you can lose the game, just getting unlucky, because it's very hard to get unlucky with this spell, since there's almost no case where it doesn't do its job. S tier for Artistry of War. And finally, the second secret spell and the last 5th level spell, Dethrone. Dethrone is a single target direct damage spell, casted on one creature, and it does 10d6 plus 20 necrotic damage, which is an average of 55 necrotic damage, and because it's 10d6, it'll usually roll near the middle distribution of that 55, with a constitution save for half. Now, there is a severe bug with this spell, and the Constitution save is always DC 18, no matter what the caster's save DC is. Since this has to be learned by a wizard who will usually have high save DCs and high DC gear, a DC 18 con save is going to be much lower than your normal save DC for most cases with the character, so enemies are going to be much more likely to pass this saving throw than you would think otherwise. Of course, it's also a constitution save, which enemies typically have very good constitution saves, and it's necrotic damage, which a lot of enemies in the game are resistant or immune to. So Dethrone, while it does a lot of damage on paper, the fact that the save DC is really low and targets con saves, and a lot of enemies are going to resist or be immune to this damage, means that in practice you're usually going to get a lot less damage than it seems like you should when you cast this spell. One other cool thing about this spell is it has a 100-foot range. Almost every other spell in the game caps out as a 60-foot range, so it does let you hit enemies from further away, which can be pretty useful. It also has a mandatory long rest cooldown, similar to Artistry of War, which can only be cast once every short rest. Dethrone can only be cast once every long rest, no matter how many 5th level spell slots you have, or if you're using free casting or whatever. This is a 5th level spell slot for a kind of mediocre amount of damage to a single target. Spending that 5th level spell is just usually not going to be a good use of your action or spell slot. So Dethrone is rarely, I think, going to be valuable. You can, because it is a necromancy spell, use free casting with the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, in order to cast this spell for free, but you can still only do that once per long rest. So even if you have a character that's built around using the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, Dethrone is rarely going to be better than anything else. And also, if you compare its damage to just upcasting Inflict Wounds, which is often going to be the thing that you're doing with a character that's built around that, the damage isn't even favorable compared to that. So honestly, this is a single target damage spell that's extremely unreliable because enemies will usually make the saving throw or be resistant to the damage, and it just doesn't do enough damage to justify the cost. D tier, unfortunately, for Dethrone. Alright, my friends, that is the 5th level spells. As you can see, there's a lot of real stinkers amongst the 5th level spells, but there's also some incredibly powerful and important spells. Conjure Elemental is obviously the big winner, which in a lot of cases is a 6th level spell, so your 5th level spell slots are often going to be used to upcast lower level spells. But there are still some that are pretty important to know about. Hold Monster is obviously extremely useful when you can't use Hold Person, and the B tier spells here give you a lot of really neat tactical options, and even the C and D tier spells include some that you can do some pretty cool things with. So, although 5th level is almost certainly the weakest spell tier overall in Baldur's Gate 3, there's still a lot of interesting stuff in this spell level. I think it makes sense, of course, that this is a really weak spell level. In tabletop Dungeons & Dragons, 5th level is where you get to start really breaking the laws of physics and the laws of narrative, doing things like teleporting across continents or seeing what your enemies are doing in the midst of their stronghold. But a spell like Teleportation Circle or Scry doesn't really make sense in the context of a video game, so we're left with a lot of just direct damage spells, and 5th level spells suffer, which are pretty exciting in tabletop, have suffered as a result of just the fact that you're playing a video game and a lot of the coolest things you do at this spell level don't really translate. But nonetheless, this is still a very powerful set of spells that give you a lot of really interesting options. As always, of course, if you think that I have misrated any of these spells, especially if you think there's any I have placed too low, definitely let me know in the comments. As always, I'm very open to moving things around, and of course, if you compare this list to my previous 5th level spells list, you'll notice a lot of them have moved up since then already, so very open to moving spells around based on good arguments. Make those in the comments below. Of course, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to hit like and leave a comment of any kind. Helps me out with the algorithm, so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 spell tier lists. We'll come back with the level 6 spells and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.